Hey guys, so in the last couple of days, a whole ton of major polls have been released for this year's Senate elections, many of them from A-rated pollsters. We have new numbers from major races like Wisconsin, Florida, Arizona, to the Keystone State of Pennsylvania, where John Fetterman leads by 10 points against Mehmet Oz, a double-digit margin according to the A-rated Marist College. We also see that in the Tar Heel State of North Carolina, Sherry Beasley's internal poll shows that she and Ted Budd are in a tie to succeed Richard Burr, the retiring incumbent. However, the biggest poll that we've seen over the last couple of days, and probably over the last couple of weeks, is this new poll from Ohio. The Buckeye State currently is expected to vote for Tim Ryan by 3% against J.D. Vance, according to the A-rated Siena College. This poll really is going to shift my prediction for Ohio quite a bit, and so in this video, we'll be going over every single one of these new polls and what they mean for their respective races. So we're going to start off with that new poll from Ohio. Tim Ryan has recently expanded his lead to 0.6% against J.D. Vance. This is going to be one of the most important elections of the year. Ohio should not be this close. J.D. Vance is running a horrible campaign against Tim Ryan, and that's why J.D. Vance is doing so poorly in the polling. Trump won the state of Ohio by 8 points in 2020, the same margin in 2016, and in 2016, Rob Portman won his third term to the Senate by 21 points against Ted Strickland. So just 6 years later, as Ohio has shifted more and more to the right, the Senate election is actually going to be even closer. Tim Ryan has been a staple in Ohio politics for 2 decades now after winning 10 consecutive terms in the House of Representatives. And so J.D. Vance has no previous political experience. He has run no campaigns before. He is an author and also a trader. So, J.D. Vance is not somebody with the experience that Tim Ryan has. And so that's going to be a major issue for him in the coming month, as Tim Ryan knows how to win a political campaign. Now, I do think, though, that Tim Ryan is still the favored candidate, as he is the Republican. The R next to his name on the ballot is going to make a significant difference in a state as Republican as Ohio. It was a purple state for decades, but now Ohio has clearly taken a turn to the right. However, this new poll from Siena College really is a major one, as it's the first A-rated poll to show Tim Ryan leading, and Tim Ryan actually leads by 3%. Now, this poll did not oversample Democrats, and it did not underestimate Republicans either. When voters were asked who they voted for between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they voted for Donald Trump by 8%, the exact same margin that Trump won Ohio by in the previous election. And not just that, Joe Biden has a net negative 15% approval rating according to the respondents of this poll. And if you look at the governor poll that they conducted, Siena College did both a Senate and governor poll with the same 642 likely voters, they said they would vote for Mike DeWine against Nan Whaley by a 23-point margin. This poll shows Republicans in the governor's race with the highest margin compared to any other poll that was released in the last couple of months. And so Mike DeWine right now is outperforming J.D. Vance by 26%. J.D. Vance's campaign really is in trouble. The odds for Vance have dropped all the way down now to just 70%, the worst odds for Vance we've seen in quite a while, or maybe even the worst it's ever been, or the worst it's ever been is 68, but now we're at 71, so it's pretty close. J.D. Vance is not performing well in this race at all. Tim Ryan is catching up, and in the next month, if we see some significant shifts, I may even move Ohio into the tilt Republican column, or maybe even the tilt Democratic column, but right now, I have Ohio as being lean Republican, although barely. I think J.D. Vance does have the very slight advantage. Next up, in Washington, Patty Murray leads by 12% against Tiffany Smiley in the most recent poll. This is going to be a two-way race, as they both came in the top 2 of the open primary a couple of months ago. Patty Murray is going to easily win her second term. She already won a majority in that primary. If you look at the final results, Patty Murray came in with 52.2% of the vote, which means that even if voters for every other candidate in the blanket primary voted against Patty Murray would still be reelected. And so she might not actually win by a solid margin. At least that's what the polls currently show. Polls have Murray up by 9.8%, but this is mainly a result of some outlier polls, especially from the Trafalgar group, which have Murray only up by 2 and 3%. I think these polls are absolutely absurd. Patty Murray is going to win by double digits, but I don't think it's going to be over 15 points. I think a 13 to 14% margin is much more realistic. So even though Washington is going to be a solid Democratic state, the margin isn't going going to be over 15, so I'm going to move it down into the likely category. Patty Murray is still basically guaranteed to win re-election, but it's just going to be slightly closer than margins we're seeing in other Democratic states like Illinois, New York, or California. 538 currently gives Patty Murray a 97% chance at winning, which is slightly lower than the odds for Democrats in states like Oregon or, once again, California. Moving on to Wisconsin, this is one of the most important races of the year. We have another new public policy poll. Ron Johnson must win re-election in Wisconsin if Republicans want to stand any chance at winning back the upper chamber of Congress. If Ron Johnson loses in Wisconsin and Mandela Barnes is elected the next U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, Republicans will 100% not gain back control of the Senate. So Ron Johnson is running for his third term in office. Mandela Barnes is the current lieutenant governor of the state, and polls show a very close election between the two candidates currently. Ron Johnson leads by 0.5% in the polls. He recently took the lead after a string of polls showed Ron Johnson the favored candidate against Mandela Barnes. If you saw the polls that were released in early September, Ron Johnson led by 1% in 3 of them, then 4% according to a poll conducted by the National Republican Senatorial Committee, and then 2 recent polls from Trafalgar and Emerson both have Johnson up by 2 and 4 points. However, this most recent poll shows a tie between both Mandela Barnes and Ron Johnson. This may be good news for the Barnes campaign, but in the very end, Ron Johnson is going to have to be behind in the polls by quite a bit for me to categorize the state as being lean or tilt Democratic. Ron Johnson is probably going to outperform expectations like he did in 2016 and like Donald Trump did in 2020. Polls in Wisconsin have been wrong over and over again. They've almost always overestimated the Democratic candidates, and so Ron Johnson is going to have to be behind by quite a bit for me to categorize the state as going for Mandela Barnes. So right now, I have Wisconsin as a lean Republican state. I think Wisconsin is actually going to vote to the right of Ohio, despite Ohio being a state that's significantly more conservative, at least at this point in time, when comparing previous election results. 538 gives Ron Johnson a 61% chance at winning. With the new polls that have been released, Ron Johnson's odds have gone up. At one point, he only had a 51% chance at winning and was almost close to losing the frontrunner status, but now as a 2-time incumbent, Ron Johnson should win his re-election to a 3rd term on the 8th of November. And moving on to the Sunshine State of Florida, Marco Rubio is running for re-election to a 3rd term with Val Demings as the Democratic challenger. This race is going to shape Florida politics for the next decade. Whether or not Val Demings can even get close to defeating Marco Rubio, she's currently down in the polls by 3.8%, but as Florida continues to shift to the right, I expect Marco Rubio to outperform polling expectations. In 2016, he won his re-election against Patrick Murphy by 8 points, and in 2018, Republicans flipped the final Democratic Senate seat in Florida, where Bill Nelson was the senator for 18 years before Rick Scott won by 0.1% 4 years ago. And this was the only major flip for the Republican Party in 2018, and it really did come as a surprise, as Bill Nelson was leading in basically every single poll up until the very end. And in the presidential election of 2020, Donald Trump won Florida by 3%, the largest margin since Bush won the state by 5 points in 2004. And so Florida is not the purple state that it once was. Republicans do have a clear advantage. Even though polls in Florida are showing a tightening race, Marco Rubio is still on track to winning his re-election. Of course, right now there's only one major Democrat elected to statewide office, and that is Nikki Fried, and she's only the agricultural commissioner. So 538 gives Florida a likely Republican rating. Marco Rubio has an 86% chance at winning his re-election, and I do agree with that forecast. I have Florida as a likely GOP state on my map as well. I don't think Rubio is going to win by double-digit margins, but I think that he's definitely going to win by over 5 points, with Val Demings being an unsuccessful challenger, as Marco Rubio is one of the strongest incumbents in the country and is a good candidate for a state like Florida. Next up in Arizona, we have a new Marist College poll. This is an A-rated pollster, and they show Mark Kelly defeating Blake Masters by a double-digit margin. Now, many recent polls have shown the election in Arizona starting to tighten just a little bit. Mark Kelly did lead by double digits a month ago, but now he's only up by 7.4%, with many recent polls showing Mark Kelly only ahead by 1%. However, these polls from Data for Progress and the Trafalgar Group are likely to be outliers, but I don't think they're going to be that far off in the very very end. I think that Mark Kelly is probably not going to win by over 5%, but I do think he will get close. I think that he's going to win by around 4 to 5%. I think that range is going to be the most likely. So there is a chance that Mark Kelly does win by a likely margin, but I think that it's more likely that he does win by the lean margin that he won by in 2020. He won the special election against Martha McSally. McSally was at the time the appointed Republican incumbent, so she did not win any elections. She actually lost to Kirsten Sinema in 2018, but Doug Ducey did appoint her to the seat after the death of John McCain and the resignation of John Kyle. So Mark Kelly's win in 2020 was not as great as Democrats would have hoped. He was leading the polls by a significantly larger margin, and that's what I think is going to happen again this time around. Mark Kelly up by a very impressive margin in the polls. Blake Masters is a pretty weak Republican nominee, so it's not that surprising that Mark Kelly is doing well, but I think that he will still underperform polling expectations as Democrats typically have done in Arizona. Joe Biden definitely did so by a little bit. He was expected to win by 2 points. He only won the state by 0.2%. So Mark Kelly right now, I do have him winning his re-election. 530 actually gives him a 83% chance at winning. I mean, this is a pretty high, and he's currently expected to win by a 6-point margin. I think that's just a bit too favorable for Mark Kelly here. I still have Arizona as a lean Democratic state, and I think that in the very end, my rating is going to be slightly more accurate. And moving on to Connecticut, this is the final poll that was released just today as Richard Blumenthal attempts to win re-election against Leora Levy. Levy won the Republican nomination a couple of weeks ago, and now she is the official challenger to Richard Blumenthal. Blumenthal was re-elected in 2016 with 63% of the vote. It was a landslide against Dan Carter for Blumenthal, and in 2022, he is actually in a significantly more competitive race. Polling only shows him up by 14.7% on average, and every single poll released for this race has shown Blumenthal with a double-digit margin, not as strong as it was 6 years ago, and nothing too close to 20%. So I still do expect Richard Blumenthal fully to win his re-election, but I think that the race is going to be slightly more competitive, with Republicans pouring slightly more money and energy into this race. But in the end, Leora Levy is not going to be elected the next U.S. Senator from Connecticut, and that's why it's going to remain a solid Democratic seat. And now we're going to get sidetracked just a little bit and go over a 2024 poll that was released from the state of Virginia. Tim Kaine leads over Glenn Youngkin by just 2 points, and Glenn Youngkin is, of course, the incumbent governor of Virginia. He was elected in 2021 against Terry McAuliffe. He won by 2 points, and it was a major victory for Republicans, as Republicans had not won a major statewide election in Virginia for over a decade at that point. And so now Glenn Youngkin is being floated as a potential 2024 nominee to challenge Tim Kaine, but I do think that it will be unlikely. Tim Kaine is an incumbent, and he really has a lot of experience running in Virginia. He was a former governor and then now a 2-term senator, so Tim Kaine will be very difficult to defeat, even though he was not the greatest vice presidential nominee in 2016 when he ran with Hillary Clinton. But Glenn Youngkin will only be in his 3rd year as governor in 2024, and I don't expect him to run for Senate that soon. I think that maybe a 2028 run after serving 7 years as governor is much more likely. So Glenn Youngkin may be a potential candidate, but right now I still expect Tim Kaine to win his re-election in 2024, and I don't think that Glenn Youngkin will end up being one of the Republicans vying for the nomination. And now coming back to the races that will actually be held this year, we have new polls from Arizona, Colorado, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. All these polls released just yesterday, but we've already gone over Arizona, so we're going to start off now with Colorado. And the Trafalgar Group, the most right-wing pollster in the country, shows Michael Bennet winning against Joe Dea for a 2nd time in a row by a margin of 6%. And so Colorado right now, we see a pretty interesting race, as Joe Dea is a pretty moderate Republican. If you had a much more extreme MAGA Republican as your Republican nominee, Michael Bennett would be winning by double digits. In 2016, he only won by 5.7%. He still did better than Hillary Clinton, but really not that great of a margin. In 2020, Biden won the state of Colorado by 13.5%, and then on the Senate level, Cory Gardner was defeated by John Hickenlooper by 9.3%. So huge Democratic wins in the last general election, and we're probably going to see something similar for Bennett this time around. I think that Michael Bennet can win by 9 points. I think a double-digit margin is still unlikely, but I do have Colorado as a likely Democratic state. I don't think Joe Dea will get within 5 points of Michael Bennett's support this year. Colorado has just shifted so significantly to the left over even just the last 6 years. I mean, if you go back to presidential elections in the early 2000s, George W. Bush carried Colorado by a margin of 5% in 2004, and then a margin of 8% in 2000. So Colorado is not the red state or even purple state that it once was. Just like Florida, it's shifting in the opposite direction. So that's why Colorado is going to be a likely Democratic state. I've had it as likely for a very long time, and that margin is probably going to stay until the election in November. And next up, in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman is running against amendment odds in the Keystone State to succeed Pat Toomey, who was reelected in a surprise win 6 years ago against Katie McGinty by 1.4%. This race was expected to go to the Democratic Party, just like the race in Pennsylvania this year. It's also expected to go to the Democratic Party with John Fetterman as their nominee. The only difference, though, is that John Fetterman is performing significantly better against amendment odds than McGinty was against Pat Toomey, and Pat Toomey was also the Republican incumbent. Amendment odds has no experience running campaigns in the past, and he really has nothing to do with Pennsylvania. He has never lived in the state, he has no major businesses in the state, and he really only ran for the seat because it was left open after Pat Toomey chose to retire. So John Fetterman is outperforming expectations, at least the expectations that we had for Pennsylvania at the very beginning of the 2020 election cycle. This race was going to be very close. Of course, Pennsylvania was a seat that Republicans held, but the seat was going to be vulnerable as Joe Biden won the state of Pennsylvania by 1.2% in 2020. However, in a year like 2022, it should be difficult for Democrats to flip a seat like this, but with John Fetterman as the nominee, the Democratic Party is running away with this race, and this is not even looking at the governor election in Pennsylvania yet. That is even more of a disaster for the GOP. Josh Shapiro up by 10.2% on average. Every single poll shows Josh Shapiro winning against Doug Mastriano, who is the worst gubernatorial nominee this year. And if you look at the Senate election, every single poll as well has shown John Fetterman defeating amendment odds. 538 actually gives Fetterman an 81% chance at winning this election, and he wasn't even almost the favored candidate for quite a while. At one point, he only had a 35% chance of winning, so he wasn't even close to being the frontrunner in this election against amendment odds, but now he has such a significant advantage. This race went from being a race that Republicans were going to win by 3 points, now to a race that Democrats are going to win by over 5%. So Pennsylvania is going to be a lean Democratic state according to my ratings. I don't see John Fetterman winning by over 5 points. Just like in Arizona, the state is still a very purple one, and even though John Fetterman is going to win, he's not going to do surprisingly well. He's still going to underperform expectations, and that will still probably be enough for him to win, as he does have a huge buffer with that 7-point lead. And now moving on to North Carolina, a poll conducted by the Cheri Beasley campaign shows her and Bud in a tied race. Now this poll has actually bumped up the margin for Bud in the polls, as this was an internal poll for Beasley, so the numbers are probably going to be realistically slightly better for Ted Budd, but this race is still going to be very close nonetheless. At one point, Bud had a 5-point advantage in the polls. That advantage has basically disintegrated, and for a tiny sliver of time, Cheri Beasley was actually the frontrunner according to the data itself. And so many polls have shown Beasley ahead, but there have also been more reliable polls that have Bud leading. And so what we're seeing right now is that North Carolina, the polls suggest a very close election, but realistically, Democrats are going to underperform. They severely underperformed in 2020. Joe Biden lost North Carolina despite winning both Georgia and Arizona. And the big surprise was actually Georgia. Nobody thought Joe Biden would win Georgia without winning North Carolina, because basically every single poll showed North Carolina being more blue than Georgia. And 2020 really was a very good year for Democrats to win North Carolina for the first time since 2008. The last time that a presidential candidate of the Democratic Party won the state was all the way back in 2008 when Obama defeated John McCain. And on the Senate level, it was also 2008. 2008 was a very good year for Democrats. As you can see here, they won 59 seats, and Kay Hagan was the last Democratic senator from North Carolina, and she would lose re-election in 2014 to Tom Tillis, who would defeat Cal Cunningham in 2020, despite every single poll showing Cal Cunningham defeating Tom Tillis in that 2020 election just 2 years ago. So Cheri Beasley, unless she's up pretty significantly in the polls, I don't see her winning this election. I have North Carolina right now as a lean Republican state. I don't think that Ted Budd is going to win by any sort of big margin like Richard Burr did in 2016, but it will still be enough of a margin for him to become the next U.S. Senator from North Carolina, the Tar Heel state, and 538 right now gives him a 65% chance at doing so. And so I was just about to end the video, but we have 2 new polls that were released during this recording, and they're from Fox News. These are A-rated pollsters, and they're from the states of Pennsylvania and Georgia, so of course I'm going to go over these new numbers. In Pennsylvania, we've already gone over the state, but John Fetterman's margin has dropped slightly now down to 7.1% as a result of this new poll, but still a pretty significant margin, and considering that it's from Fox News, the poll is probably going to be relatively accurate. Fox News' polls do tend to be pretty good, and they were pretty accurate in predicting many races in 2020. Now, the other poll that they released was from Georgia, where Raphael Warnock actually leads by an even larger margin. And so Warnock is now up on average by 2.1% against Herschel Walker. This race is definitely going to be the closest one of the year alongside Nevada, and Raphael Warnock is clinging on to his survival as Herschel Walker is catching up. Many of the most recent polls have shown Herschel Walker as the preferred candidate here in the Peach State, but in the most recent couple of days, we have seen that Warnock is doing slightly better, and of course, this poll showing him up by 5% is reminiscent of that fact. So Fox News, Warnock up by 5 points against Herschel Walker. This expands his lead just a little bit. It was just 2% and then actually fell to 1.7% at one point earlier this month, but polls in Georgia have been known to be relatively accurate. They were very accurate in 2020, and so a 2-point lead is definitely something to watch out for. So right now, I have Georgia as a tilt Democratic state. I think it's going to be a very slight victory for Raphael Warnock, but still, it's going to be a big win for Democrats and probably enough for them to hold on to the Senate, as long as they can also carry New Hampshire, which will be significantly easier to win than even states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, or Arizona. And so that'll be it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Today we took a look at the latest Senate polls that were released. A lot of new numbers, especially from these A-rated pollsters. And of course, as the midterms are now getting closer and closer, I'll keep you guys updated on these new numbers every single day. We have political content coming out on the daily here on the PA Election HQ channel. So like this video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win the Senate majority. And do you think these new polls, especially in states like Georgia, Pennsylvania, or Arizona, will actually end up being correct? Do you think Democrats will win all 3 of these races? Do you think Republicans will actually carry Ohio, North Carolina, or Wisconsin? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I'll see you guys in the next video.